The courtroom's silence was shattered only by the bailiff's voice calling, "Ethan Marshall." No one stirred, until a tall, composed black man in a worn gray suit rose from the back and made his way down the center aisle. Calm and deliberate, he carried no lawyer, no papers, no entourage, just himself. Two officers at the back leaned in, one muttering, "That's probably one of those fake sovereign citizens. Gonna tell the judge the laws don't apply." His partner chuckled, loud enough for a few heads to turn. Ethan's face remained still, unreadable, as though he'd seen this moment play out before. The judge, an older white man with thinning hair and a radio voice, flipped through a file. "Mr. Marshall, you're charged with failure to comply during a lawful stop. Is that correct?" Ethan's voice was quiet, but steady. "That's what the report says." "No counsel? I don't need one." Snickers echoed from the back. But Ethan stood firm. Slowly, he reached into his coat. One officer's hand hovered over his holster. Ethan paused, then drew a slim, laminated badge and placed it on the judge's bench. "Ethan Marshall," he said, voice unwavering, "Director of Internal Affairs, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The room fell into stunned silence. The officer's smug expressions faded as the judge blinked in disbelief. Ethan's presence, once dismissed, now commanded the room. It wasn't about bravado, it was a quiet, powerful reminder that justice isn't about titles, but integrity. The night was humid as Ethan Marshall drove his inconspicuous silver sedan down a dim stretch of Highway 45 near Biloxi, Mississippi. He had spent the day quietly visiting small police departments flagged for troubling patterns, irregular reports, suspicious use of force, and, most recently, malfunctioning body cams. He didn't advertise who he was. His preference was quiet observation. As he neared a motel on Bayou View Drive, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Ethan sighed and pulled to the shoulder, his heart heavy with the weight of too many similar stops. Two white officers in their mid-30s approached, one bald with a flashlight already in hand. The bald officer knocked sharply on the driver's window. "License and registration," he barked. Ethan lowered the window halfway. "What's the reason for the stop?" he asked evenly. "License, registration," the officer repeated, sharper this time. "You didn't use your blinker at that last lane change." Ethan glanced at his dashcam. "I'm pretty sure I did." The second officer appeared on the passenger side. "You got something to hide?" he challenged. "No," Ethan said calmly, "but I'd like to know if this is a traffic stop or an interrogation." The bald officer's temper flared. "You giving me attitude? Step out of the vehicle." Ethan, maintaining his composure, handed over his license. "Just a regular ID. No badge." "Where are you headed?" the officer asked. "Can't say," Ethan replied, invoking federal protocol. That was the trigger. The officer's voice sharpened into a sneer. "You think you're above the law?" Ethan didn't answer. The second officer yanked open the passenger door. "Get out now." Ethan's voice remained low. "This stop isn't lawful anymore." They didn't care. Rough hands dragged him from the car, twisting his arm, pinning him to the ground. He didn't resist. He didn't shout. But even as his cheek pressed against the gravel, his mind remained clear, cataloging every word, every action. Unknown to the officers, he had started recording the moment the lights flashed behind him. Standard practice for men who looked like him. Especially in the South. At the station, the narrative shifted. The officers filed a hasty report. The suspect was verbally aggressive, refused to identify his destination, resisted arrest. No mention of their own hostility. No mention of the unnecessary force. No body cam footage. Ethan asked for their badge numbers. They replied with cold stares and a sneer. "Don't worry. You'll have plenty of time to ask questions in court." He was placed in a holding cell overnight, denied a phone call or supervisor. Alone in the dim corridor, under flickering lights, Ethan sat quietly, not with fear, but with the familiar realization of how easily the truth could be buried under a fabricated report. What the officers didn't anticipate was that Ethan wasn't just another name in a file. He was the person who would crack their carefully maintained system of silence. The next morning, when they hauled him into court for his hearing, the two officers still wore smug expressions. They didn't know who he was, only that he was alone, quiet, and, to them, insignificant. But when Ethan stood before the judge and placed his FBI Internal Affairs badge on the bench, the courtroom's dismissive smirks dissolved into stunned silence. The office's bravado collapsed. They realized, too late, that they had targeted the very person tasked with investigating departments like theirs, the kind that turned off body cams, falsified reports, and let aggression go unchecked. "You didn't ask," Ethan told them quietly, "but you should have." This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. It was a failure to see the humanity in someone they thought they could control. Ethan wasn't a man looking to cause a scene. He was a man determined to document, to hold accountable, to refuse to let his story be silenced like so many others before him. The office's disbelief was a microcosm of a larger pattern, a system that discounted voices that didn't carry authority or badges. But this time, the truth would not be hidden. And Ethan's badge was not just a symbol of power. It was a mirror reflecting the failures of a system that had long gone unchecked. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating, the weight of realization pressing down on every pair of eyes fixed on Ethan Marshall as he placed his slim, laminated FBI badge on the judge's bench. Moments earlier, they'd dismissed him, a quiet man in a wrinkled gray suit, mocked for his silence, for not bringing a lawyer, for not complying during a routine stop. Now, those same voices were stunned into a heavy, almost palpable stillness. Even the officers who had dragged him in, Dell and Miller, sat stiff, eyes darting between the badge and Ethan like they were witnessing a ghost. The judge, who had barely looked up from his file before, now blinked in disbelief. "Mr. Marshall, you're claiming to be with the FBI?" he asked, voice faltering. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Not claiming," he replied quietly. "I am Director of Internal Affairs, FBI Southeastern Division." He gestured to the badge. "You can verify the number with Director Travis McCall's office or the Inspector General in D.C. A long beat passed before Darlene, a seasoned court clerk with a sharp instinct for truth, stood and offered, "Would you like me to place that call, Your Honor?" The judge nodded a bit too quickly. While Darlene made the call, the courtroom sat frozen. Even a toddler in the gallery fell silent. Dell whispered to Miller, "No way this guy's for real." Miller, voice tight, replied, "That badge looked real. His ID was real. We're screwed." Ethan heard every word, but he didn't react. His eyes remained fixed on the judge, whose authority now felt brittle behind that bench. Darlene returned 5 minutes later, holding a notepad. "Confirmed," she said quietly. "He's FBI, Internal Affairs, Southeastern Division, 27 years of service. Rank checks out." The courtroom shifted, but this time, the silence wasn't dismissive, it was heavy with embarrassment. The judge, the prosecutor, the smirking officers, they all understood now that they weren't simply dealing with a man accused of minor noncompliance, but a federal investigator who had caught them red-handed. Ethan spoke calmly, his voice filling the space with quiet authority. "I didn't come here to cause a scene," he said. "I wasn't even here to file a complaint. I was on assignment, traveling through departments under current review. I remained calm, followed the law, and yet I was assaulted, detained, and silenced. But I documented every word, every violation. I know exactly what procedures were broken." The judge leaned back, hands clasped tightly, no longer in control of the room. "Mr. Marshall, Ethan cut him off, voice still steady. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here to request that the charges against me be dropped immediately and that both officers be placed on temporary administrative leave, effective immediately, pending federal inquiry." The prosecutor opened his mouth, but the judge raised his hand before a word could escape. "Granted." The officers looked stunned. the bald one nearly shouting, "You're suspending us? Just like that?" But the judge, aware now of the weight of the situation, remained silent. Ethan turned, facing them directly. "This isn't about me," he said evenly. "This is about every person you've treated like they didn't matter. Every citizen who didn't have a badge to pull out." His words cut deeper than any formal reprimand. A quiet dismantling of their assumed power. Outside the courthouse, word of what had happened spread like wildfire. The gallery emptied quickly, as though the building itself was radioactive. Dell and Miller stood near the exit, pale, stunned, and suddenly realizing how deep the consequences might run. Ethan didn't linger. He walked to his car, sat in the driver's seat, and finally let out a slow breath. These moments weren't satisfying. They were heavy. They meant someone had failed again, not just an individual, but an entire system that had normalized abuse of power, excused misconduct, and silenced victims. This courtroom, where Ethan had been dragged in as if he were a criminal, was now the very place where justice had begun to turn. And as the door closed behind him, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The sun was just beginning to rise as Ethan Marshall sat in his modest motel room. The hum of the air conditioner the only sound breaking the silence. His laptop screen glowed softly, a folder open with names, dates, and patterns, evidence of systemic misconduct buried in reports that had been conveniently ignored for years. What had started as one man's wrongful stop was quickly unraveling into something much larger. The deeper Ethan dug, the clearer the pattern became. Missing body cam footage, altered reports, cases marked unfounded, and a chilling consistency in targeting Black and Latino drivers. It wasn't about a single bad decision. It was about a culture, a system that quietly enabled certain officers to abuse their power while higher-ups looked the other way. That morning, the weight of his findings became undeniable. Grace Mendoza, a compliance strategist from Washington with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, arrived with Nathan Cole, a digital forensics expert. Together, they walked into the Jefferson County Police Department, not with fanfare or threats, but with quiet determination. Officers who once exchanged smug glances now avoided eye contact, their footsteps echoing nervously down the tiled hallways. Grace immediately took over the records room, requesting every disciplinary file, traffic stop log, personnel evaluation, and internal affairs report. Nathan slipped into the server room with Brian, the department's IT technician, who reluctantly handed over access credentials. Files were cloned, logs traced, and backups examined. It didn't take long before Nathan flagged suspicious deletions, files related to Ethan's own case. Entries deleted manually by Curtis Dell. Not once, but twice. Meanwhile, Tamara Wells, who had quietly observed the department's operations for years, sat with Ethan in a back office. She scrolled through old reports, her expression growing darker with every new file. "They all look the same," she murmured. "Pulled over, claims of aggression, body cams off, no follow-ups." Ethan nodded grimly. "It's not about isolated incidents. It's about what gets ignored, what gets hidden, and what the culture teaches everyone to accept as normal." Tamara turned her laptop to show him an old case from last year. A man stopped after work, ordered out of his car without cause, marked as non-compliant. "Same language every time," she said. Ethan's lips tightened. It was a pattern, not a coincidence. In Sheriff Ricky Halburn's office, Grace demanded the department's training documentation on use of force escalation and camera operation policies. Ricky, who had been reeling since learning of Ethan's identity, pointed to a dusty cabinet. "Everything's in there," he muttered. Grace flipped through the binders, her expression hardening. "This is 4 years out of date," she said flatly. Ricky said nothing. Nathan, moving quickly through digital files, uncovered 2 incomplete videos, one with audio from a patrol car microphone. Though short, the clip was damning. Ethan listened, his face impassive as he heard the familiar exchange, the officers escalating, the dismissive tone, The words, "Federal Protocol," followed by the sounds of force. "This is enough," Ethan said. Rising from his chair, he walked directly to Ricky's office, where Grace was still sorting through outdated files. "We're issuing a compliance hold," Ethan stated. "No officer from this department is to participate in field operations until the review is complete." Ricky slumped in his chair, his voice low and tired. "You're shutting us down?" Ethan's voice was calm but firm. "You know what happens if we don't." As the door closed behind him, officers in the hallways averted their gazes. Even those who had never met Ethan before felt the shift, the weight of accountability settling over a department that had long been shielded by silence. Tamara met Ethan at the base of the stairs. "I pulled the complaint logs," she said. "There's a pattern in the denials. Most marked unfounded, without a single interview." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Who signed off?" Tamara handed him the list. Curtis Dell's name appeared again and again. Ethan folded the paper, tucked it into his coat pocket, and gave a nod. "Good work." Tamara hesitated. "Do you think it'll change anything?" Ethan paused, glancing back at the bustling department, where whispers and sidelong glances replaced laughter. "That depends," he said quietly. "Do you?" The truth wasn't just coming out, it was being dragged into the light. And it wasn't going back into the shadows. By the end of the week, Ethan Marshall's story had traveled far beyond the walls of the Jefferson County Courthouse. Local news outlets were the first to pick it up, airing a grainy clip from a patrol car microphone, the unmistakable thud of doors, sharp voices, and that calm phrase, "Federal Protocol." It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a question echoing through homes, barbershops, and churches. At the Oakland Cafe, a group of older men argued over steaming cups of coffee. "They pulled that man for no reason," one said. "Thought he was just another guy to push around." Another countered, "Well, if he didn't show ID, he did." A third cut in, "License was clean, and even if he hadn't, that's no excuse for how they treated him." Across town, in the Jefferson Avenue Community Center, a group of parents met unofficially, their faces drawn from years of warning their kids about what to say, how to act, how to survive a traffic stop, tired of explaining that respect wouldn't always keep them safe. By late afternoon, the town hall was packed. Mayor Harold Lanning, trembling hands clutching the podium, faced a crowd both angry and desperate for answers. "We're aware of the investigation," he said. "We're cooperating fully with federal authorities. We will make changes." But from the back of the room, a woman's voice rang out. "We've heard promises before." It was Felicia Green, her son's complaint dismissed years earlier. Her voice cut through the murmurs. "Don't just look into it. Act." Applause broke out, hesitant but real. Ethan stood near the back, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd. He hadn't come to speak. He came to listen. Tamara Wells slipped in beside him halfway through, whispering, "Didn't think this many would show." Ethan's response was quiet but resolute. "They always do, when they stop being afraid." One by one, people stepped up to the mic. A teenage boy spoke of being stopped while walking home from football practice. No reason given. A young mother described being pulled over twice in the same week. Asked if the car was hers, her toddler crying in the back seat. An elderly man shared a story from decades earlier, how he'd been pulled over, cuffed, and let go without explanation, because no one cared to listen. These stories, long hidden in silence, finally found their voice, and the town was listening. Then, unexpectedly, Sheriff Ricky Halburn stepped forward. His face, usually composed, was drawn and weary. "I've been in law enforcement for 31 years, he said, voice rough, "and I'd be lying if I said I haven't failed some of you." "We didn't know who Mr. Marshall was," he continued, glancing at Ethan. "But that's not the problem. The problem is we didn't care who any of you were." "That's on me." A few murmurs, a few nods. "We're going to reopen those dismissed complaints," Ricky added. "We'll work with federal oversight, and anyone who's part of this pattern will be held accountable, including me. A woman near the front shouted, "Talk is cheap." Ricky nodded solemnly. "Then hold me to it." Ethan said nothing, but Tamara glanced at him. "You believe him?" she asked. Ethan's gaze stayed fixed on the sheriff. "I believe the room," he replied. The meeting ended quietly, but people lingered outside, gathering in small clusters, voices hushed but determined. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but something had shifted. The silence had been broken, and once it shattered, it couldn't be ignored again. For Ethan, this wasn't about a badge or the attention it brought. It was about the mother who'd comforted her child after being pulled over. The boy who had nodded at him outside the courthouse, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. The elderly man who'd carried his story for decades without being heard. Ethan's quiet determination wasn't about heroism, it was about holding the system accountable. Not just for himself, but for those without a badge, without a voice, without a chance. And as he stepped outside into the fading light, he knew that this was only the beginning. The quiet murmur of the newsroom gave way to a tense silence as the full weight of Ethan Marshall's investigation became clear. No longer just a tale of one man's wrongful arrest. The story had cracked open something deeper, a system that had been left unchecked for far too long. At the Jefferson County Police Department, the atmosphere shifted from casual confidence to tense anticipation as Grace Mendoza, the unflinching compliance strategist, and Nathan Cole, the digital forensics expert with a quiet but commanding presence, returned with Ethan. Together, they weren't there to make noise. They were there to expose every crack, every cover-up, every missing file that the department had hidden under the pretense of routine. While officers cast wary glances from behind their desks, Grace took over the records room with precise efficiency. She requested personnel files, traffic stop data, internal affairs reports, anything with a paper trail. Nathan vanished into the server room, aided by Brian, the IT technician who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with what he was uncovering. They combed through logs, restored deleted files, and flagged suspicious activity. And it wasn't long before the pattern revealed itself: falsified reports, missing footage, and access logs showing Curtis Dell's involvement in the deletions of crucial bodycam files, not once, but twice. Meanwhile, Tamara Wells, now acting as liaison for federal oversight, sat with Ethan in a back office, scrolling through old case files. "It's all the same," she said, voice low. "Pulled over, claims of aggression, cameras off, no follow-up, over and over." Ethan nodded, his expression tight. "It's not about one bad stop," he said. "It's about a culture that's been allowed to fester. A system where silence became normal." He pointed to a file from the previous year. Another man stopped for no reason. Labeled as non-compliant. Released with no ticket, no arrest, and no explanation. Tamara's fingers hovered over the mouse. "They thought no one would notice," she muttered. But now, someone was noticing, and everything was beginning to unravel. In Sheriff Ricky Halburn's office, Grace requested the department's outdated training manuals on use of force and body cam operation protocols. Ricky hesitated, his usual bravado replaced with weary resignation. "Everything's in that cabinet," he said, gesturing limply. Grace flipped through binders thick with dust, sighing as she read their outdated procedures. Nathan worked quickly, his searches revealing audio and video fragments from patrol car mics, grainy but clear enough to confirm what Ethan already knew. The words, the escalation, the force. "This is enough," Ethan said quietly, placing the headphones on the table. Ethan walked straight to Ricky's office, his calm presence now carrying the weight of inevitable change. "We're issuing a compliance hold," he said, voice even. "No officer from this department is to participate in field operations until the review is complete." Ricky leaned back in his chair, eyes hollow. "You're shutting us down?" Ethan's reply was steady. "You know what happens if we don't." The air in the department shifted, thick with the realization that the shield of silence was breaking apart. Later that afternoon, Tamara met Ethan at the bottom of the stairs, a stack of complaint logs in hand. "There's a pattern in the denials," she said. "Most marked, unfounded, no interviews. And Curtis Dell's name shows up again and again." Ethan folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket. "Good work," he said. Tamara hesitated. "You think this will change anything?" Ethan glanced at the officers around them, some avoiding eye contact, others frozen in uncertainty. "That depends," he said softly. "Do you?" By Wednesday morning, 2 black SUVs rolled silently into the department's rear lot. The DOJ team had arrived, and with them came the next phase: systematic audits, personnel interviews, mandatory compliance checks. Grace and Nathan led the charge. With Ethan by their side, officers who once scoffed at accountability now shuffled silently, the weight of what was happening sinking in. The cleanup wouldn't be fast, and it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, the truth wasn't being buried, it was being unearthed, layer by layer, until every hidden failure saw the light of day. By the time the dust settled around Jefferson County's once impenetrable walls of silence, Ethan Marshall's investigation had revealed far more than just a few bad stops or broken cameras. It had uncovered the deeply ingrained rot that had allowed those failures to persist. But for Ethan, the battle wasn't about revenge or vindication. As he sat quietly in his motel room, the faint glow of his laptop casting shadows on the wall, his mind wasn't focused on his own victory. He thought instead of the people whose stories would never make the news. The boy who was stopped walking home from football practice. The mother pulled over at night while her toddler cried in the backseat. The elderly man cuffed for rolling through a stop sign decades ago. They didn't have a badge or a voice loud enough to reach the courtroom. They didn't have a laminated ID that could silence an entire room. Ethan had to be their voice. In the days that followed, the impact rippled far beyond Jefferson County. Small news outlets picked up the story, airing the grainy footage from a patrol car microphone. The clear and damning phrase, "federal protocol," echoing through living rooms and barbershops. But it wasn't just the footage that resonated. It was the dawning realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. A mirror reflecting a system that too often protected itself at the expense of those it was meant to serve. At local cafes and community centers, people gathered in quiet clusters, retelling the story, connecting it to their own experiences. Ethan's badge had shaken loose a silence that had hung heavy for years. In a town hall packed to capacity, people demanded answers. Mayor Harold Lanning stood at the podium, pale and visibly shaken. "We're cooperating with federal authorities," he said, his voice unsteady. "Changes will be made." But Felicia Green, whose son's complaint had been buried years ago, stood defiantly. "We've heard that before," she said. "Don't just talk, act." Scattered applause rose from the crowd. Ethan, standing silently near the back, nodded slightly. Tamara Wells, now an official liaison for federal oversight, leaned over. "Didn't think this many people would show up," she murmured. Ethan's response was measured. They always do, when they stop being afraid. But even as the community's voice grew louder, Ethan knew that change wasn't about headlines or public declarations. It was about what came next. In Sheriff Ricky Halburn's office, Grace Mendoza and Nathan Cole worked methodically, sifting through files, cross-checking reports, reconstructing digital evidence long thought lost. They weren't there to make noise. They were there to ensure the failures that had allowed misconduct to thrive were dragged into the light. Curtis Dell, once a symbol of unchecked authority, now sat quietly in a corner office, stripped of his badge, his role in the cover-up undeniable. His silence now mirrored the silence of those he'd once dismissed. Ethan's quiet determination, his refusal to be silenced, had become a symbol not just of accountability, but of integrity. It wasn't about proving his own power. It was about using it for those who couldn't. As he walked through the courthouse square, a young boy in a blue hoodie glanced up, nodding silently, a gesture of recognition and respect. Ethan returned the nod. understanding that small moments like these, acknowledgments of shared understanding, were far more powerful than any grand speech. That week, the Jefferson County Police Department stood under federal supervision. Officers suspended, policies under review, and a culture of silence finally cracking. But Ethan knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a longer, harder road. As he prepared to leave for his next assignment, his phone buzzed with messages from Washington, follow-ups, questions, requests for updates. He muted them, just for a moment, and sat back to reflect. This fight wasn't about him. It was for every person who had been silenced, dismissed, and ignored. And though the work was far from over, for the first time in a long time, he believed it was finally beginning. As the sun dipped low over Jefferson County, Ethan Marshall sat on the edge of his motel bed, his shoes still on, phone buzzing with follow-ups from Washington. But for the first time that week, he let the notifications wait. He sat there, still, letting the weight of the past days settle around him, not the headlines or the procedural victories, but the quiet truths that mattered most. He thought of the boy who had nodded to him outside the courthouse. The silent acknowledgement between two people who understood too well what it meant to be judged not for their actions but for how they looked. He thought of the mother who had to explain to her child why they'd been pulled over. Of the elderly man who had carried his story of injustice for decades without anyone to listen. These were the people whose voices had been stifled by a system too comfortable with its own silence. Too ready to dismiss complaints as unfounded. To erase lives into paper trails and missing footage. Ethan's role wasn't about showing he had power. It was about using it to hold the system accountable for those who didn't. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or make a spectacle. His quiet determination had been enough. And the badge he carried wasn't what made the difference. What mattered was his choice to act, to listen, to document, to bring light to the shadows. In a world that often teaches us to stay quiet, to stay in line, to not make waves, Ethan's story is a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is to refuse silence. It's not about anger or noise, it's about integrity. About refusing to let another name, another story, slip into a file marked, unfounded. The lesson is simple but profound. Real change doesn't happen because someone has a badge or a title. It happens because someone chooses to act, quietly, steadily, and with purpose. It's about seeing the humanity in others before making assumptions. About standing up when others won't. About listening to the voices that have been ignored for far too long. And most of all, it's about recognizing that silence is not always peace. Sometimes it's just the sound of injustice waiting to be confronted. So, to everyone reading or watching, if you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever felt like your story didn't matter, remember that your silence isn't weakness. Your calm isn't surrender. Sometimes, the quietest voice carries the most weight. Ethan's story isn't just a reminder of one man's stand. It's a call to action for all of us. To listen, to act, to refuse to let another story be buried under paperwork and excuses. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't let it end here. Comment below. Share your thoughts, your stories, your own moments of standing up or refusing silence. Let's make this conversation bigger than just one case, one courtroom, one town. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one, they're not fiction, they're reminders, and we need more of them, now more than ever.